Hey everyone, today we're going to jump into two major concepts which I think are going to really help improve a lot of the creativity and productivity in your workflows. First, we're going to get into how abstracts and patterns and shapes can help influence your media. And secondly, we're going to get into depth maps and ControlNet and some of the depth anywhere magic that is starting to happen in the industry. So let's get to it. Okay, well, let's start with our very first concept here around abstracts. I have a very quick prompt here, just a quick fire mountainscape, and I'm using a cool new LoRa that I found online. I'll include the link in the description, called Abstract, NV Abstract. And it helps basically transform your images into almost like abstract painting. So in this case, instead of showing actual mountains, it's more of like a pattern. But not to worry, we're going to actually be using this and leveraging this in a way that you'll see is pretty cool from a more realistic, photorealistic perspective. And in terms of the setup here, the normal loader, I'll be including this obviously as always in the workflow materials. And nothing also special here. You know, I do have, I'm using LCM as I have in my other videos to help speed up renders. But again, it's a pretty straightforward type thing. And again, you can use any sort of scene you want, or even concept. And what this LoRa will do is basically make almost like an abstract painting. Okay, so since I'm using bookmarks, I will jump to number 2. So you could see from here, I took that abstract image, that output, and just did a normal image-to-image, a VAE encode that's going into my sampler. And now I'm using a more detailed prompt about what I want that mountain lavascape to be like. And so I want a man, you know, with a metal hazmat suit, you know, with a drone, etc. Now, I didn't say anything about details around the background, other than that, you know, the drone is flying in the background, right? We have lava tubes and pits and some stuff like that, and that's giving it some of the information, but you can see all the details are coming from our abstract painting, right? You could see how the lava flows and the curvature follows it really closely, because what we're doing, similar to the previous videos we've done around gradients, is we're using this as our painting landscape, right? Kind of our boundary. And this is going to be kind of like the starting point for the diffusion to happen. So it knows to pull the colors. It knows to pull the sort of general shapes to help defining how things are going to go. But you can see in this abstract, of course, there's no person, there's no drone, right? It's using this as a starting point to then make it go further. So this is pretty cool. In terms of, again, the type of rendering setup, we have our Mile High styler, which we're not using any special styles this time, but we're bringing these prompts into a normal clip text encode. Now, again, why are we doing a separate clip text encode? Because we're using that use everywhere with the beaming as in previous videos. And so we want to override the beaming by actually forcing the text and forcing the conditioning into the sampler so that it uses this sort of prompt specifically. Same thing with the negative as well, which obviously we don't have anything in this case. So we're going to go and we're going to render this, and this is all good. Now, this is nice, right? You know, it's following the abstract like we said, but it kind of looks a little fluffy, like it doesn't have, let's say, the level of detail that we would want in, let's say, a final kind of production type image. So we're going to take it one step further and go to step 3. So step 3 is using ControlNet, and I have 2 little examples here. I'm going to bring him over here, right? We have 2 depth preprocessor models that we're using here. The typical one is this sort of Midas depth map, or there's some other sort of depth maps available. But there's a brand new one that just came out, I'd say in the last month or so, called Depth Anything. And there will be links, and you can actually load them in your manager. If you go to your Comfy manager and go to the models, you can search for Depth Anything and any other depth models you want as well. And the cool thing about this, there is actually a few different versions. I actually like the middle one in this case, but you'll see that it has slightly different results. You can see the difference in terms of how this is going to be represented in the image, right? So depth maps, just for a very quick context, is a black and white scale picture, which you can see in here, which tells you where distance-wise in your image your subject and your backgrounds are located. So things that are closer to you in the front are going to be white. Things that are all the way in the very back are going to be black. And so by doing so, you're helping to define the location of your elements of your picture. So you can see there's a pretty big difference here in terms of how things look. Now, you may say, well, this traditional depth map routine is much more kind of detailed in terms of that drone and the person. But the challenge here is you could see the white shows this person all the way at the very front, and even the drone is really white as well. So that would mean they're at the very, very front, where this one can show it's a little grayer, but there's more levels of also detail in these ridges, and it has a lot more of that kind of depth detail. If I look just as an example here with my guy here, right? So you could see if the person was all the way at the front, he'd be kind of right in the middle of the screen at the very, very front, but he's actually pulled back a little bit, matching the mountainscape. So you could see that even though there's a little bit more detail in, let's say, the drone, in the traditional depth map, you could see that in terms of the overall quality of the depth that's coming through, it's actually a little bit more detailed with this newer model method. And so from here, we're going to start to use ControlNet. Now, the cool thing about ControlNet is, and we're going to go into ControlNet into a different video in a more advanced way, is you're basically controlling the way that diffusion happens on your image. So you're basically significantly guiding your diffusion to happen the way that you want it. So as an artist, as a content creator, this is very important because in your head you have a particular vision of what you want, and therefore you would like to paint it or create it in a certain way. And so this is going to help control your subject matter in a more significant way. So to set that up, basically we have something called Apply ControlNet. It's a foundational module, so you don't have to download anything special. And there's 3 inputs here, right? The first one's an image, and that image is actually not your source image, but is your image of what you want to apply. So in this case, we're doing depth, right? We're going to be applying the depth to our kind of refined image. And we're going to pipe that image, so in this case, from our depth anything, into there. ControlNet, you need kind of like almost like the central brain of how is it going to control? And so that's going to be going to our ControlNet loader, right? And you can choose different kinds. In this case, we do depth, but we'll go in different videos around posing and canny and soft edge and some of the other ones available. But for now, we're using depth. And these models also, you can download off your Comfy Manager and go basically to your install models area, and you can install that. And then finally, conditioning. And so conditioning is how are we going to create via prompt or other sort of modifiers? How are we going to apply this control to our prompt? And so what is this coming from? This is coming from our original prompt. So our man, metallic, hazmat suit, et cetera, et cetera. So it's using this, it's starting with this, but we're going to modify it because we want to apply our depth stuff to it as well. And so that is going to pipe here. In this case, we're just using positive. So we're just using the conditioning of the positive. These other 3 items, we have a strength item here. This is really helpful if you want to, let's say, pull it back a little. We don't want full control. We want to give it mostly control of giving it depth information. In this case, we want full control. So we're having a strength of 100%, basically 1.0. And that pipes into the positive sampler of your kind of refiner. Now, the negative, right? So you're like, well, where's the negative? Well, we could have a separate negative prompt if we wanted to. In this case, we're using our beaming, right? Our kind of use everywhere to beam our negative from where we created it before. Same thing goes for model, the latent, etc. One other piece that you can do, by the way, because you may want to pipe your latent from your image, which is highly recommended too. You can bring that latent all the way over here as well. And that'll help, give it its special starting guide as well. In this case, because we're giving the a very strong depth map. We're giving it a lot of instruction of how to create that image, but you can definitely do that to create some additional control. In terms of the settings of the sampler, it's going to now, we're not using LCM in this case because this is kind of our refining or polishing stage. So in this case, we want to go kind of full detail. And in that case, we're doing our normal model, but we're using exponential scheduling. The denoise I have at 90%, right? So which from previous videos, you know, is a pretty heavy kind of giving control to the AI to create the imagery. And that's fine in this case because we want to give it a lot of control. And you can play with this to see how much of the control you want to give, how much creativity versus how much of the original image you want to use. And I'll show you an example of why that's important. And that's basically it. Everything else is pretty much standard as well. If you want to see what the final image comparison looks like, I'm going to just go and slide across here. You can see there's a significant amount of more detail, but it's keeping the original image pretty much the same throughout. Now, one thing you'll notice between the two, right? Look in the back corner here. Do you see the lava is missing, right? And that's because I didn't pipe that latent in. If I piped the latent in, then it would start with the fire and the lava, and it would just continue to bring that additional detail in. So that's a choice. Again, most people, if you're going to just provide additional detail off of your original image, you could simply pipe that latent in, and that'll be great. But you can see lots of power there to keep and control your image as you're running along and you're influencing it with that abstract. Okay, our second example is using shapes to influence our render. So similar to what we did in the last example, we're going to be using the latent space as a way to influence how things get diffused. So in this case, right, I'm creating a prompt around spaceship travel, cockpit, background, captain sitting, some red reflections, etc. And in this case, by the way, model-wise, I'm using Colossus. I like Colossus for some of the sci-fi stuff. It's been really good about that. And otherwise, the load is pretty much the same here as usual. So we're going to go to stage 2 here. And this is where the fun comes in. So ComfyUI Studio, it's a custom node, as I've focused on in the past, has a lot of cool shapes and pattern options, nodes that you can use to create a lot of things that could influence your latent. So in this case, I used one called Starburst Lines, which basically creates a star. A couple of things here that I did a little interestingly. First of all, I have a different one. Sometimes it's a little hard to kind of remember my hex codes for colors. So what I did was there's a custom node called MixLab Nodes that you can bring a color node in. And basically it's a color selector. It's a lot easier to select a specific color. You can hit save, cancel, right, to have that color. And you're just piping that hex color into the hex value of this, right? And just a reminder, any of these sort of inputs, you can always right-click a node and change them into an input. And by doing so, then you're just piping in that value. So in this case, I took the hex value and piped in for the background color for that purple. And for the other one, I just used red. So I just chose red. Another thing I did here is I offset it a little bit. So originally it's in the center. And then otherwise the number of lines, etc., you can modify as well. Now, when you install that ComfyUI Studio node, there's actually a lot of cool other shapes that you can choose. So you can, if you go into graphics here, you have different patterns, right? So these are like the things like the gradients like we've done before. We have the starburst, different lines. You have different shapes. You could do shapes. We're going to be focusing on the random shape here in the next example. But you can see lots of different options to create these color elements. And the color elements, remember, we're going to then take and pipe into our VAE encode, right? So we're using that as our kind of foundation. And then finally, from there, we're going to then do our render. Now, I'm using, in terms of the prompt, the same exact prompt from the beginning, right? Which was the spaceship and the cockpit, etc. But here's the cool thing, and I'm going to drag this over here just to show you the level of influence you have. You really have a lot of influence when you create these latent spaces to what your end image is going to be. So in terms of denoise, of course, how much you want to do. If I lessen to denoise, it's going to look almost like just this picture right here. If I go 100%, just as normal, you're giving full AI control, and it may barely use this at all. So you have to kind of play again, just like the gradient example, you want to play with it to get to the right level, kind of adjust it, run it, and if it's not what you want, you can kill that process and over a few times, but it's, we're talking seconds and not, minutes or hours. And, but you can see, you can get a pretty substantial effect for using that. Okay, our final example here is using the latent space and influencing it. But in this case, we're using patterns and shapes. So in this case, normal sort of setup, I'm using Bastard Lord, which is our top SDXL model right now. I'll have a link to the top 10 SDXL model list. We'll have a future video on how that top 10 list becomes a reality. But here we have a rusty wire fence, animals, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the advanced part of this exercise is actually going to be, we're going to take two different kinds of shapes or patterns, and we're going to bring them together to create our kind of initial latent space to then render off of. So in this case, I have something called, again, both of these are from ComfyUI Studios. We have one called polygons. Polygons, you can choose hexagons or triangles and have how many rows and columns and what are the colors, etc. So in this case, I almost created like a kind of a blue, almost looks like a beehive, right? But it's going to become the basis of our fence. And the cool one, I think, is this random shape pattern. You can just basically choose the number of rows and columns. You can change the colors, which you can see both these times I mapped to that color node for easy selection. And you just pipe it out. And so you can see, right, random rows and columns. I did 4 and 3. I just threw random shapes here in colors. And we have this. Now, I'm going to blend them together from the was node suite. And in this case, there's a node called image blend. And you just basically pipe them in together, and then you say how much you want to kind of blend them together. So in this case, I want to heavily influence using my hive and then have a little bit of influence with my shapes. So it kind of creates this kind of cool, again, almost abstract-like image at the end. And this is what's going to be the basis, our foundation for rendering our image. In this case, I turn my preview off. We have it going to the VAE encode, right? And from here, we're still using the same prompt as we have at the beginning, so the barnyard scene with the fence, et cetera, et cetera. We're piping in that image to turn it into a latent, and then from here, you can see we have a lighter denoise level, but we're rendering it fully, and then we're going to bring it forward. So you can see here's the original pattern that we had rendered, and I'm going to now slide across, and you can see it really closely matches the shapes that we had created. Now, it's not going to be exact, but you can see it's heavily influenced between the two. So it's a really cool way to show your creativity and starting it off with a really good foundation. So hopefully this was helpful. As always, please feel free to share with your friends, like and subscribe. We want to help people be able to create really great content and help people to learn more and more about Comfy and Stable Diffusion. And have a great day.